I'm John Serruto, and I'm representing Hometown Television tonight. It's a real pleasure to be at the Summit Library to have a free-flowing conversation with Mark DiIonno. And most of us know something about Mark DiIonno, but to just qualify him that much further, we know he's a Pulitzer Prize finalist, which is just an outstanding honor in any sector of writing.
Thank you.
He's an author of a number of books. He's an investigative reporter. He's a reporter. But more importantly, I find that Mark DiIonno is a New Jerseyan who has his boots on the ground day in and day out. He has a pulse of this state like nobody else, and he's the ear and the voice of the state of New Jersey. So tonight, we're going to have this open dialogue. We're going to touch on some planned topics, and we're going to open up a lot of conversation to the public, and we'll have a free flow with all of us together. So Mark, we welcome you, and you know, I called you an investigative reporter. What exactly is an investigative reporter versus just a general reporter?
Well, a general reporter goes to the fire. An investigative reporter finds out why the fire department took so long to get there. You know, and that's really true. You know, when we had the Seton Hall fire, we were there to cover the fire, and then we discovered that while the dorm was burning, the guys at the Vailsburg Fire Department, who were a block away, were playing cards, eating chili, and the South Orange Fire Department was 3 miles away, and they got the call. And so our investigative reporting changed how Essex County how Essex County rigged up their alarm systems, so that from Seton Hall fire on, the closest firehouse would get notified, as well as whatever municipality the fire was in. So that's, you know, I can't really make it any more clear than that. Now, someone like me, as a columnist, I actually do both. So I'll go to the event, like the hurricane, and then I'll cover the immediacy of the hurricane, and then I will continue to look into why the recovery is so slow, what actually happened, and you know, things like that.
All right, but let me ask you this, Mark. In certain situations, obviously, it's your opinion. Other situations, it's really fact-finding. Mm-hmm. And the general public today is skeptical of a lot of reporting.
Rightfully so.
So what type of due diligence do you do, or what type of due diligence do you think is important for your industry before they put something out in paper?
Well, the industry and me are two different things. You know, and I have to always, I spend more time defending this industry than I do in any other aspect of my life. Rightfully so. You know, today we had a story about Donald Trump pulling the Washington Post press credentials because of a headline in their paper that said Trump insinuates Obama was connected to the Orlando shooter. I mean, and that's not at all accurate. And that's the Washington Post. They didn't say he was connected to it. He insinuated that the president hasn't done enough to root out these Islamic terrorists, but to then, that's not connected. That's a different thing. So I think a lot of times the culture of our country is very disturbing to me right now. It's just about hate and anger, and so, you know, the media is party to that. You know, the media has created an audience of, you know, a very partisan audience, and it feeds that audience. And in my view, the media's job should be to explore our similarities, not exploit our differences. And that's just not what the media's job is anymore. The media's job, I shouldn't say the job, the media agenda is to really pull people apart. You know, we have different stations that do that. We have different print outlets that do that. In the internet world, you know, everyone has an agenda. I always thought that if somebody came out and said, we are going to be the moderate voice and give both sides to everything, and you can hold us to that, that paper would be enormously successful, because I think people have a real desire for that. But we're not really getting that, in the country today.
Well, let me ask you this. Oftentimes, you and I have talked about this in the past. You wrote a book about it, sensationalization. Do you find that maybe there's independent agendas today more so than, maybe not more so than 40 or 50 years ago, as your book reveals? Is it for commercialization?
Well, a lot of websites that, you've all heard the clickbait idea. Websites are trying to show advertisers that they can attract a lot of readership. And so they create sensational stories that are going to get a lot of clicks. So my view of this is we have basically cultivated an audience that's semi-literate, that is only interested in the most sensational and prurient stories. And then we've put them in charge of the product because we're following their lead. So if this story gets the naked mentally ill woman gets more clicks than some government malfeasance, well, that's a more important story. It's like McDonald's is the best restaurant in the country because the most people go there. I mean, it's that sort of truth of majorities that's taken over. And, when I was breaking into the business, the media sort of tried to lead in directions of fairness, of intellect, of a certain class, dignity. And now we are being pulled in a different direction by the base interests of the public. There's many times when I've just said, eventually we're all going to just be doing pornography because that's what gets the most clicks, And it's really kind of a sad state of affairs.
Well, you mentioned the word Orlando a little bit ago, and this morning I read a really nice column that you wrote about a couple in New Jersey that lost their son at Virginia Tech, and maybe you can share with the audience the tie-in and what that does to the emotions of these families.
There's going to come a point in time when the violence, the gun violence in this country touches all of us. And it probably already has, because we are now all starting to think in those terms. I have a daughter in Thailand right now, and I'm thinking, is this like a place where they blow things up? Is this one of the, every time a kid gets on an airplane, is this the day that, so it's already changed us. But this particular column was about a family whose son went to Virginia Tech. And they packed off their son, expecting him to get an education and go on with his life. And instead, while he was in German class, he got shot. And, sort of the literary device of the column, and believe it or not, I actually think about those things. People say, like, oh, you're just right. Well, actually think about it a little bit. The literary device of the column was the sort of ordinariness of life. People get shot going to class. People get shot going to the movies. People get shot going out to dance. People get shot going to the mall. People get shot going to work. Now in our ordinary lives, this gun violence has changed, how you think about your ordinary life. Is this the day? Is this the day someone's going to shoot up the mall? So in this particular story, I had interviewed the family prior to today, but today was the first day I asked the mother of the young man what she did for a living, and when she told me she was a maternity nurse, and she said, "I bring life into the world." And it just kind of resonated with me immediately. Like, here's this woman who had a son shot and killed, and there she is, delivering these babies, day after day. She holds this precious life, and does it go through her head that, like, well, one day my son was like this, And one day maybe this kid will be in his German class at Rutgers University when somebody decides to make some kind of insane statement. And she said, yeah, I wonder, you know. And boy, that was a really impactful thing. So the whole column kind of spun out of that, from ordinary birth to ordinary activity of just living, and the potential of what is becoming a very uniquely American tragedy. If you study the trajectory of mass killings, they really begin to take off. You know, you always had a nut. We had Howard Unruh, you know, in the 1940s, walking down the railroad tracks in Camden, New Jersey. He was a World War II veteran. Killed 14 people. And then you have to go to 1960, and there was something in Lubbock, Texas, Luby's
Tower.
Right? Then you go to the 1970s, and there's San Ysidro, and then there's the clock tower. You know, every 5 or 10 years, you get something. And now, every 6 months. You know, every 6 months. Well, San Bernardino was Christmas. This is June. The man from the father of the boy from Virginia Tech actually said, somebody actually said to me, well, at least you guys aren't the worst anymore. And he said, I didn't know how to respond to that. You know, what does that mean? Like, are we keeping, you know, this is the Joe DiMaggio hit record here. What are we talking about? You know, and unfortunately, that's, you know, sort of where we are.
Well, you also, speaking about American tragedy, let's turn it into an American victory. We've talked about the Revolutionary War, and we saw a column that you wrote maybe a month ago about the encampments in the local area.
No, sure, yeah.
You know, so many of the things that have happened here, I've enjoyed going to, and I recognize a few people that I've had lunch with at the Beacon Hill Club, but now I understand there's a little history in that Beacon Hill area, and the Hobart Gap, and some of the other parts of the Watchung Mountain. Can you tell us something about the Revolutionary War?
Well, of all the stupid things we do in New Jersey, and there's plenty of them, I think the stupidest thing we do is just we have completely forgotten our important history in the formation of the country. You know, I can't imagine that a school kid growing up in Summit, New Jersey, or Milburn, or Springfield understands that the Revolutionary War of attrition was won right here. Yeah, George Washington spent half of the war behind these mountains that we live in, that we don't even consider mountains. You know, we don't even have that sense of it. Oh, there's Mountain Avenue, Valley Road, Mountain Avenue, Valley Road, Ridge Road. Oh, I live in mountains. Oh, that's why I can see New York from there. You go up through the Hobart Gap, you're doing 80 miles an hour. It doesn't feel like they were ever formidable.
Where is the Hobart Gap?
Right where the highway comes through, right between Short Hills and Summit.
So what is the importance of the Hobart Gap? What was it that Washington and the generals wanted to control?
Let's start at
Gap?
the beginning, okay? You know, the Hobart Gap is a gap in the Watchung Mountains, and so the Indians, when they were going from the seashore or from you know the water to inland, would take the path of least resistance. The same thing that highway engineers would do 300 years later. So the gap, that then it became a stage. You know, when English, you know, white people came, it became the stage route. Then they paved it and everything else. So during the American Revolution, when George Washington was holed up in Morristown, the British from Staten Island saw the Hobart Gap as a way to get to Morristown without having to go up the cliffs. You know, the higher cliffs. And so it was a very critical defense point. And all along the Watchung Mountains and mountains all through New York State and New Jersey, there was a system of beacons. And one of those beacons was at Beacon Hill, because it was a high point in the gap. So it was a defense point, and which is why you had the Battle of Springfield, because the British were coming basically up Morris Avenue, what is today Morris Avenue, trying to get to Morristown. And that's when the skirmishes occurred there. So it was very important strategically. This area was very, very important strategically. That's why we have a Washington Rock at South Mountain because they could spy on the British in New York. The Washington Rock in Greenbrook looked towards New Brunswick and the south. So the Watchung Mountains, which are basically a check, they go like this. New York's here, New Brunswick here, the road to Philadelphia is here. So they could really kind of see everything from this vantage point, and it was hard to penetrate.
Well, interestingly, in researching this, Mr. DiIonno, which you made me do, I learned more about the American Revolution than I certainly did in school over the last 3 hours. But my question was, they talk about the Connecticut farms. Now I'm thinking, Fairfield County, it's so beautiful. Yeah. Where were the Connecticut farms?
Union. Connecticut. One of the interesting things about New Jersey, which has really, it's sort of inherent in our history, is that it's one of the few colonies that wasn't founded by a particular religious sect or even people from a particular country. So we had Swedes in South Jersey, we had Dutch in Bergen County, we had English, we had Quakers outside of Philadelphia, and people from other parts of the country, like Connecticut and Massachusetts, came here to expand their province. So Connecticut Presbyterians came to New Jersey and had Connecticut farms. Newark was founded by Robert Treat, who I think came down from Massachusetts, in Connecticut also. Thank you. In 1666. So there was always this movement of people into New Jersey, which has never changed. We're still, at the time of the American Revolution, we were the most diverse state in the country, and we still are, essentially.
Which we'll talk about later on in our discussion in Free Flow. But listen, at this time, I have a lot of questions for you, but I also know that some of these people do. And my president, Fred Arnold of Hometown Television, and I had a little discussion last night, and you had some great questions about Main Street, Chatham, and who walked on it, and some of the other areas. So, Fred?
Hey, Mark.
Hi, Fred. Hey.
Good, how are you? Listen, you read about all history, and I'm wondering, right in our backyard here, who have you found that's been here? Washington clearly standing on the rock. What about Adams? What about Jefferson? What about Franklin? Hamilton, yeah.
Hamilton was here. Hamilton and Lafayette were certainly here. Hamilton met his wife in Morristown. I think her name was Schuyler. Yeah, Anne Schuyler. And in fact, the Hamilton actresses of the stage play came to the DAR house in Morristown about a year ago, just to sort of get a sense of the place where they met. I was supposed to cover that, but something else came up, and unfortunately I wasn't able to do it. But George Washington was certainly in Chatham, and one of the I've given many talks to like New Jersey historic preservationists, and they always wrestle with this idea of what do you do with the building? Do you make it a museum and I said, the most visited Revolutionary War site in New Jersey right now is Scalini
Fideli, yeah.
Scalini Fideli. There's a month waiting list to get into the restaurant. George Washington stayed there. That's what you have to do with these places. You gotta give them some other use and then introduce the history to people and try to get them interested in that history. So that's certainly, there's a reason that Washington is such a part of our vernacular in our state. There's 7 Washington, municipalities. It's not just to honor him. It's because the guy was actually physically here for a long time. Yes, sir.
Mark, where exactly was Beacon Hill, and what is the significance of it?
Well, Beacon Hill is Beacon Hill is where the club is, and the beacon that they lit to bring the militia down to fight the Battle of Springfield was at the house next door to the club, coming up Hobart Avenue. And at that home, there's a couple of markers by the DAR. It's on the lady's front porch. And so the beacon system, which was designed by Lord Stirling from Basking Ridge, the idea was if the British were making a move into the Watchungs, you would light a beacon and that would tell people where to send the militia. And the New Jersey militia was actually pretty lousy militia, but at the Battle of Springfield, they really responded well. And George Washington actually made a note of that in his notes about the Battle of Springfield, how the Jersey militia finally responded in a honorable way. Because the Battle of Springfield was really between loyalists supported by British and American patriots. Yes?
Just to add something to that, part of my problem with New Jersey, coming from Massachusetts,
Of course.
where everything has a marker and a
Right.
historical, and we really preserved history. I find there's not that much of it here. And actually, the Beacon Hill, right, the house next door, does have a plaque, but it's on the tree lawn. There's no sidewalk. It's overgrown. So the DAR this year made a copy of the replica of the plaque and put it in the arboretum so that you
Oh,
can
that's great.
see.
That's very good. Thank you. That's good information. Yes, ma'am.
It's probably not an accident, but this is Summit, and across the highway is Short Hills. I
Right.
mean, that
Right.
must be indicative of the topography,
Right.
even though it was Turkey Hill at one
We're,
point.
we're one of the highest points. The Overlook Promontory is one of the highest points in the Watchung Mountains. Absolutely, especially at this end. Yes, sir.
So you brought up how things haven't been marked up that well. We haven't pulled it together in the state on a historical standpoint. What kind of suggestions would you make?
Well, there is supposed to be dedicated funding, a hotel tax that was supposed to go to dedicated funding to bring up historic sites and promote historic tourism. But that is one of the casualties of various administrations because they waste so much money on legal fees and other corruption that they can't afford to fix the roads or prop up our historic sites. Now, there's a long, long history of this. Much of it stems from the fact that the state has always had two identities, the Philadelphia and New York identity. So we do not have that sort of cohesive state identity like a place like Massachusetts or other states. So that has always been a problem. And I think the other problem is because of the diversity of the state and the high immigrant influx in the state, nobody has, I shouldn't say nobody, a lot of people who have come into the state aren't really invested in the history of the country when they first get here. My grandfather was a landscaper in Milburn. My dad grew up 100 yards on the Main Street side, 200 yards from the Battle of Springfield site. He didn't learn about that at home. His father could have cared less. He wasn't invested in that. He was trying to make a living. My father becomes a public school teacher and learns about it. His son, me, writes a book about it. So it takes a little while for that sort of Americanism to take hold. And I remember one day I was speaking to the DAR in Morristown, and some Mexican kids were walking down the street, and I said to them, "This is your future. You can't hang on to the fact that your bloodline has to go back. You have to bring other people into this sense of our country's history." So I think that's been a uniquely New Jersey problem, is that so many different people come through. Elizabeth should have been preserved as the Athens of the colonies. It was one of the most important cities in the colonies. But when you look at who has come through Elizabeth in the last 250 years, you can understand why we don't have that passion for it. The people who live around Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, have, 15 great-great-grandfathers in nearby cemeteries. That doesn't happen in New Jersey. Everybody's from New Jersey. Everybody leaves New Jersey. President Obama's family's from New Jersey. It's true. So, everybody kind of launches from here and goes out.
We may be talking about that down the road here in this conversation, see if there's a way to correct that.
Yeah.
But any other questions? Yeah.
I wonder if you could talk about some of the investigations, bringing you up to the present, some of the investigations you're doing now. And I wonder if you have a particular take in terms of Christie Gate and what, because there's still an investigation going on.
I'll tell you what I think. I think Bridgegate to me is a bunch of overblown baloney. My paper has fixated on this thing, and I argue all the time about it, that the real failure of the governor's governance is not about whether his ego or his staff put up a couple cones outside of the George Washington Bridge. The real failure of his governance is that 10,000 people are still out of their homes at the Jersey Shore, their primary homes. That people have been denied benefits, not paid the insurance that they paid for, get into state programs in this morass of, a whirlpool of bureaucracy they can't get out of, and they can't get back into their houses. To me, that is the, and while that was happening, he was campaigning around the country talking about what a success it was. No, I'm not sitting here, I'm not going to be here and I'm not going to attack the governor. But you asked a question and I'm trying to answer it. That failure to me is more important than anything about the George Washington Bridge. The George Washington Bridge, it's easier to get a handle on. The mess with the hurricane is impossible to get a handle on. I've been a journalist for 37 years. I've been covering this for 3 years, from the time the storm hit. Well, it's now 3.5. I still can't figure out how to get to the bottom of what went wrong, because there are so many places where it went wrong. Federal money going to low-income housing off the shore. A program to raise houses after they were completed. Then they raise the house. Then the house gets wrecked and the contractors disappear with the money. That's state money. That's federal money. Our tax dollars with no way to chase them down or prosecute them. I talked to a guy, a confidential source who was a procurement lawyer for the state at the time the contracts were being written for Sandy, and he complained vigorously that there were no clauses in these contracts to hold these contractors' feet to the fire if they walked away. And sure enough, and not only that, but now it falls on the county to chase them, not the state. So Ocean County with their 6 cops that do 6 cops that do financial investigations, now they have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of cases, and how are they going to shovel out? It's really a mess. So to me, that's the big thing.
Ongoing investigation.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, it's really not an ongoing investigation. I think that we have sort of taken our eye off it. And for people that are not affected by it, you got your power back in Summit after 3 weeks, storm's over. Guy comes, he chops your tree down, you got some firewood, and the hurricane's over for us. But I'll tell you, I was down in Forked River Beach the other day, and it's every other house is either under construction or vacant. So it's really, to me, that's been important work that I've been trying to do for the last 3 years, and I wish others would do it too.
Well, Mark, Katrina was disastrous, and the corruption was ongoing. Bureaucracy continues, corruption continues.
And New Jersey hired the very same companies involved with that. We hired the exact same people that were involved in that. What happened was the guys in Katrina that stole money from the government side now switched sides, and so they stole money from the consumer side. They they became, instead of being the instead of being the insurance brokers who exploited the government payment, now they exploited the homeowners. So they ripped off the homeowners. We have, we've written stories about phony engineering reports. I saw this 2 weeks after the hurricane. I mean, a woman, we went down to see a woman who, her house was falling apart, and she said the insurance guy said she was a block from the Manasquan inlet that flooded. It wasn't the flood that broke your foundation, it was the shifting of the soil caused by the flood that wrecked your foundation, so therefore you're not covered by the flood insurance. And that's what they did to thousands and thousands and thousands of people. And here's the real interesting thing. Monmouth County and Ocean County are Republican counties. So the Republican legislators aren't going to attack the state run by Republicans. So I said to the Democrats, how come you guys aren't going after this? They said, well, then it gets to the federal level, and that's us. So the people are in a political no man's land. Their local elected officials are Republicans, and the Democrats don't want to challenge the mess because a lot of it happened at the federal level. So the little guy, once again, right?
Mark, you know what? We want to change gears again, and our good friend Bill Myron, the principal of Milburn High School, just came in here, and we want to talk a little bit about education.
Sure.
Being in Summit and Milburn, and you going through the Summit system, and myself and some others going through the Milburn system. What has happened to the cost of education that is just can't seem to slow down or turn around beyond high school?
You're telling me I have 6 kids. We have my last 2 children, 4 of my 6 kids have started at county college because it's the only viable option. And my last 2 have started, one's going to start at county, one's in county now. I just think that in this area, this is a really interesting thing. We talk about it all the time, like where I live. I live in Mountain Lakes. I grew up here, and now I live in Mountain Lakes, and so I've been a middle class guy in a wealthy town my whole life, and so I watch my friends send their kids off to all these schools, and $60,000 a year. One guy I know is selling his house to pay off his children's college, And I say, why don't you send them to Rutgers? Oh, well, go to Rutgers. Why don't you send them to county? Morris County College, Brookdale, Raritan Valley College. These are fine schools. Get a good education. One of my kids, my oldest kid, spent a couple years traveling around with a band, and he went back to school at county college. He was a mediocre high school student, graduated from NYU with honors, and just graduated from Rutgers Law with honors. So that's because he matured. I can't tell you the amount of people that have sent their kids to, some school somewhere. Kid comes back drunk, stoned, with 9 credits and $60,000 of his parents' money spent. So what do? The only way to control the cost is as a consumer to sort of reject it and find alternative ways to educate your kids.
So there are substitutions that
sure,
are more viable on the path up.
I also have to say this. I took my daughter down to St. Joseph's, and even she ended up at TCNJ. And when I went to Rutgers, I had come out of the Navy, and the food in the Navy was better than the food at Rutgers. We had coffee left over from Vietnam, and it was better than what we were eating at Rutgers. Now, I go down to TCNJ, there's a carving station, there's the sushi station, there's this and that. I'm like, I took my daughter to St. Joseph's, and we just built this new health club, and this new health club, and it really dawned on me, if you said to somebody, okay, I'm going to build a barracks-like college. You're going to live in a cinder block room. You're going to get a Princeton education, but there's no sports teams. The food's lousy, and there's no amenities. But you're going to get a great education. It's going to cost you $10,000 a year. Nobody would go. Now the kids are like, we're sending our kids off to these country clubs, and I'm sure Bill knows, and other parents with college-age kids. It's this arms race to build up these campuses with these amenities. And that and the administrative costs.
Well, and I also think in our local communities, we've talked about this, and Bill, you and I have had this discussion, the arms race to put them into certain elite schools. And, it's interesting, the principal looked at me one day and said, you know what, there are so many good schools. Why does it have to just be this little pyramid?
Right.
The pressure of that at 70,000.
It's crazy. And then there's this craziness. The weightlifting coach for Rutgers football makes $284,000 a year. The weightlifting coach, not even the offensive coordinator. And so, to me, I just read somewhere recently where a town in Texas is building a $45 million stadium for their high school football team. So,
There are 4 contiguous towns, and the top one is 60, and it has a roof on it.
isn't that great?
It's 18 or 20,000 seats or something.
For high school football. So there's this sort of President Eisenhower warned against the military-industrial complex. We now have a sports and entertainment complex, seriously, that it's running amok. My favorite stories, and going back to investigative reporting, some of my favorite stories that I did in the last few years was what this thievery and scam foisted on us by the NFL to host their Super Bowl. New Jersey took the brunt of the expenses. I had to go to the game. I didn't really want to because I had been a sports writer. The novelty wore off years ago. It looked like an occupying force of police up there. It did. It looked like, an Iron Curtain situation. And we paid all that overtime. And these cops were cops down there from their canine units from South Jersey that came up. We paid for all those police. I got a hold of the what they call the I guess it's called the RPI. It's the bid contract that the NFL sends out for the Super Bowl. And it basically says, you do this at no cost to the NFL. You do that at no cost to the NFL. And it was crazy. It was like, you must supply, I remember one thing that really stuck out, 100 black limousines, none of which can be older than 6 years prior to the date of the game. Like somebody can tell the difference between a 2008 Lincoln Town Car and a 2007 Lincoln Town Car. And the electricity, the upgrade of the stadium, all that stuff, we paid for that. And there was no tax revenue. They don't allow you to charge sales tax on the tickets. They kept the parking revenue. And then to make matters worse, they fenced off the stadium essentially from pedestrian traffic, which made no one in New Jersey hotels want to go there. Or made no one want to go to New Jersey hotels. So people that might have stayed in New Jersey, and there weren't a whole lot of them, stayed in New York anyway. So we got all the expenses, none of the revenue, and then the black eye when the transportation mess happened. Now that's good investigative reporting. That's saying, okay, well, everybody's over here with their pom-poms and saying, oh boy, we have the Super Bowl. You have to look and say, at what expense, at what cost, and where is the logic in this? Why are we taxpayers supporting a $60 billion corporation? And those are the kind of things I think that are important.
Mark, we talk about viability of different communities. In the last 10, 15 years, you see the resurgence of Morristown being a real energetic place to live
The
for
theaters.
all different ages. You look at Montclair, you look at, this town's always been my favorite downtown, like most of these people here, Westfield. Does Newark have a chance
Yeah.
to turn around?
Newark has a chance. Newark has a real good chance. Newark's success will be tied to the economy of New York because it's the last train stop on the path. And as long as New York is burgeoning, Newark will get a residual of that. They've been a little slow to it because Harrison kind of built up and stole their thunder, you know. But Newark has a good chance. The problem with Newark, there's two problems. There's the violence, and then there's the quality of life. And the Chief Ambrose, the public safety director, just told me this the other day. The past few administrations were so focused on the homicides that they forgot about the quality of life enforcement. Now, the homicides are going to be the homicides. When I did a story where I was embedded with the Essex County Homicide Unit for all of the month of July in 2013. I went out on every murder. I had unfettered access to everything, including the interrogations. So when the series ran, the ACLU wanted my notes. I said, no, sorry, you can't have them. But you know, one of the homicide detectives said to me, if I could take 50 guys off the street right now, 50 guys, I know who they are. If I could take them off the street, put a bullet in their ear, put them in a dumpster, our homicide rate would go down to almost zero. It would just become domestic. It would become, you know, a robbery here and there. But the drug war homicides would come 50 guys. So that homicide rate in those neighborhoods is awful. It really impacts the quality of life for the people who live in those neighborhoods. They're very scary places. There is a solution to staying alive in Newark, and it's go to bed. You know, because most people get shot like, you know, between 11 and 4 a.m. If you go to bed, you're not going to get killed normally. But the quality of life, especially downtown, has sort of fallen by the wayside, and I think they're trying to really improve that and clean up the downtown. You see a lot of interesting things in Newark, and it's kind of funny, and I don't mean to be racially insensitive, but sometimes I'm driving around some neighbors and I see like a young white couple walking a dog, and I think, like, what are you doing here? You know, and I realize, you know, that they're actually starting to move into town, you know, like that people are moving into town, young professional people of all colors. And in the downtown, one of the things about Newark that's always been interesting is, unlike any other downtown I've ever been in, I can't think of another city like this, their downtown had no residential buildings. It was not designed that way because Vailsburg, Weequahic, you know, I mean, the architecture in, you know, Clinton Hill, Weequahic, Vailsburg, Forest Hill, beautiful homes. And because the city was able to expand out and give people suburban life within the city confines, there weren't big residential buildings downtown. Now that's changing, and they're putting the residential buildings, more buildings are being converted into residential buildings closer to the train stations.
So has the arena, has NJPAC, has some of the other institutional developments really benefited the community of Newark?
Sure. You know, I think theaters are a huge, and you mentioned Morristown, you mentioned Montclair. I can think of other examples, Hackensack and some other places, Princeton, where theaters really do anchor cities. You know, unlike a sports venue where a team plays a season, theaters are year round. And so, you know, restaurants can come up and grow, and shops, and, you know, people are going to be in town. When my children were babies, my older two, and we lived in Morristown, near the Green, there were a lot of vacancies. You know, there's a a biker gang that used to hang out on the green. I guess they were all crippled. None of them could ride anymore. And they just they all hung out on the green. It was like not really an attractive place. So the theater there was really changed things. I think a lot of downtowns benefit from that, and they benefit from residential buildings. You know, Summit's always had downtown residential buildings. And when I was a kid, I used to work for the Summit Food Market, and I delivered groceries. So all these apartments around the downtown. Newark didn't have that, and now that's started.
So they had a central business district, and those little outlying communities like Vailsburg were more like a suburb.
Sure, the inner ring suburbs.
When the flight happened, there was nothing left in downtowns for people to
Well,
live.
the flight's an interesting story because, you know, we sort of always paint things in these broad brushes. You know, white flight, black people moved in and white people left. That's not exactly what happened. What happened really is that after World War II, this is fascinating history. If I'm boring you, just raise your hand and ask a question. After World War II, GM and Ford were rewarded for their war effort by the Federal Highway Act. So we are going to make a country dependent on cars because you guys did your patriotic duty and built the tanks for us. And so Eisenhower put through the Federal Highway Act. And at that time, you could get a mortgage for a house in Springfield or Summit or any place along the highway corridors. Then you could get the federally backed mortgage for a cheaper rate than you could in the cities. The highways were built to go over the cities. Think about when you drive on an interstate, you're going under a city, you're going over a city. I'm working on a story right now that's really interesting. It's about Orange and the building of Route 280 and how it went right down the gut of that city and annexed what had been congruous neighborhoods and changed forever how that city would operate. And underneath the city, the highways goes underneath, and then over it at parts. So there was a systematic design to get people out of the cities and into the suburbs. When you think about, and the New Jersey history, that is very interesting because the Route 78, 287 corridor is part of that design. I remember, I'm going to date myself. I'm a lot older than I look, actually. I think. The AT&T long lines built in Bernardsville was like one of the first suburban corporate headquarters, and it was built on the 287 and 78 juncture. So that was a government plan. That was a government design. So people had the option to move away. Had the highways not been built and the mortgages not been built, there wouldn't have been the housing availability for poor people to move in. So the white flight was sort of America growing up and out of its urban situation, World War II veterans going to different colleges, flooding state colleges, teachers' colleges, moving out of the cities. And then, slowly but surely, population from the South came in. And then when it began to really kind of take off and people saw their neighborhoods changing, then they moved out at a more rapid rate.
And of course, the 1967 riots did
Sure.
not help a lot of the cities.
But I think, too, John, and I'm not one of these guys that says, well, it wasn't a riot, it was an uprising. I don't buy that. It's a riot. Riot's a riot. Let's call it what it is. But I think that by the time that happened, they were already so far gone. And the decline of the cities, I remain fascinated by this because it is so rapid. And then you think about, well, from the time, the Victorian era, when the city was, Newark was in its heyday from like the 1880s to the 1930s and 40s. And then it started to go downhill in the 50s. So that's 20 years and 20 years and 40 years. That's 60 years of a heyday. From 1967 to now is same amount of time, right? So the heyday is really kind of a short period of time. All this was built up, these great buildings, great apartments, great houses. Same thing with New York City, parts of New York City. And they're like, well, how long was it good? It really wasn't good that long. And so we'll see what happens as, this generation, millennials, seem to be opting to move back to transportation hubs. They seem to be opting not to live the suburban lifestyles that we wanted. I know my kids, I have one kid who's going to live in Madison and one kid who's in Washington, D.C. and has no intention of ever moving to the suburbs or buying a house. And has no interest in being a homeowner.
But Mark, are we starting to see a little trending of this generation and the baby boomers that are now starting to scale down, and really, the opportunity to scale down in these communities is very little.
Yeah.
Oftentimes they want to go back into the cultural centers and the activity.
I think that's happening a lot, and you see, there's and what's interesting to me is not so much how the cities are changing. It's places like Rahway and Montclair and Union
Bloomfield.
and Bloomfield, these sort of former urban cities that are close to transportation hubs. There's a part of Montclair that was always sort of like the seedy part, down closer to the Bloomfield.
Bay Avenue.
Yeah. And they built that Bay Street train station there, and they're knocking out apartment buildings, left and right for these millennials. So I think that's what you're going to see.
Let's do some traveling, okay?
All right.
Now, for those of you, I don't know if you know, but Mark DiIonno enjoys riding his motorcycle, and he had an accident a few years ago, and he swore off it. He was never going to go back on it, but he has now returned, and he's written a number of books, The Last Newspaper Man, which we talked about, and then, of course, The Back Roads here in New Jersey. Now, can you explain to us basically the county roads, or what does the 500 number system mean? And can you also
Sure.
explain to us, how do you know where you're going, north,
I don't.
south, east, west?
I want to first say something about the motorcycle. I have had 5 motorcycles. I've crashed 3 of them. And I've come to grips with this idea that a motorcycle crash, there's a difference between a motorcycle crash and a motorcycle spill. When you have a crash, you're in the hospital for more than a day. When you have a spill, they send you to the emergency room and then you come home. So I only say I've crashed once and spilled twice. But the Backroads, New Jersey story is kind of interesting because it starts here in Summit on Springfield Avenue. And I was in the 1990s. I went out to do a feature about a guy who was a master fly tire in Califon, one of these oddball New Jersey stories. And when I left the guy's building, he said, how are you going to go back home? And I said, I'm just going to go back to Summit. He goes, well, you should take this 512. And it'll take you all the way back to Summit. He didn't know I was from Summit. And then you can get 78 from Newark. And I thought, you know what? I know that. I know this. Because I used to jump out on Springfield Avenue and just keep going into like Bernardsville and Peapack and Gladstone and drive around out to Califon. And I knew that. So I took the road all the way back. And I thought, wow, there's a lot. This was in the 1990s after I had quit being a sports writer. I thought, wow, there's a lot to New Jersey. I forgot. And I didn't really. And so I became fascinated by this idea of these long roads that would traverse many, 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 many counties. And I went back to the paper that day and I took out a map. They still had maps in those days, paper ones. And I took a red marker and I traced these long roads, and they were called inter-county roads. And that's the 500 series roads. If it has 6, it's inside the county. If it has a 5, it goes through many counties. So I looked at this and I said, boy, look, some of these roads are like 80 miles long. And you can take this road. One of the roads goes 527, which is Glenside Avenue, starts in North Caldwell, up right the Tony Soprano Mountain, where he's driving his car in the beginning with all the mansions. And it ends south of Tom's River, where you have Baptist and evangelical churches and trailers. And it goes through every socio-economic sphere layer of New Jersey. It's Easton Avenue in New Brunswick. It's, I forget the name of the road in Bound Brook. It goes all the way through Old Bridge and, down into that, sort of industrial New Jersey, down there, South River and all down there. So it's fascinating. So I've explored those roads and I've wrote a book about that. And actually that book still sells very well because nothing's really changed along those roads. I still find that the state is a place of enormous beauty, and if you get lost enough in it, you can find yourself alone in places you'd be surprised. I've been on roads in northwestern New Jersey where I don't see a car for several miles, where twisting around these various roads. Where New Jersey meets Orange County, Route 519 and 521 and up there. I'm stunned by, some of the villages that are in this town, or in this city, that like you would never, if you ever opened your eyes and just said, oh, here I am in Milford, this can't be New Jersey. It's a Ohio river town. It's someplace not New Jersey. And because the state is so compact and so ecologically diverse, which is really one of the most interesting parts about it. Up in Franklin, up in Sussex County, we have some of the oldest rocks, oldest minerals on Earth. And within an hour, you're in a place with some of the best farmland in America. And within another hour, you're into, not even, it could take you only a minute. You're in the Pine Barrens, which is a unique ecosystem, one of the most unique ecosystems in the world. Well, like right here. You can do it in the other day I was coming up a road, 539 from Tuckerton. So you're in the seaport area, and this is the oystering, clamming. Then you're in the Pine Barrens, and just like that, you go from the Pine Barrens to Cream Ridge, which is, horse country, and you go over a hill, and there's scrub pines and, soil that you can't grow anything in except it's going to catch fire. And the next thing you know, you're like in the middle of this great, literally like going from here to St. Teresa's Church. It changes like that. And you see that all the time. When you explore. And I get a lot of value out of exploring. I learn a lot about the state. And I think that's one of my strengths as a reporter and a columnist, is I actually know the state. I actually get out of the office and I actually meet people. I actually come to places like this and talk to people and see people. And I think that's very important as a journalist to do. Yes?
So I have a process question. You write on a variety of topics, so do you get ideas from people? Do people send you things? Do you have a little list? So maybe one time I like to write about this, and do you research everything yourself? How long does it take?
Yeah, I research everything myself. I always like these TV shows where the columnist has a secretary. Yeah, right.
And how long does it take you to write? So just talk to us
Okay,
about the process. And your ideas.
Okay, ideas come from sort of an understanding and a texture of life. I don't know how to explain this without sounding like an arrogant jerk, but you have like a writing voice, and to do what I do, you have to sort of be an arrogant jerk. You have to sort of feel that you have an opinion that matters, and that your take on the world matters, and that can be very, very dangerous if you don't keep it in check. If you just sit there and pontificate You're the most boring person that can, my opinion counts. So I always find it's very important for me to balance off what I think with people who might think other things that are different, or have the experience that I know to be true, that supports my opinion, but they've actually lived it. Like the family whose son was murdered at Virginia Tech. Now, I haven't lived that. Thank God. But instead of me just writing, some column about how awful this is, I introduce you to somebody that lived it. So that's one of the things that's important too, to when you have an idea, to then find somebody that can augment that idea, who can bring that idea to life. The column that let me just finish the thought. The column that I wrote today, was it today's paper? Yeah. Okay. Well, it becomes a big blur to me. Of this woman handling a baby, thinking that, geez, someday that this thing might meet the same fate as my son. I cannot capture that, any better than, I can't say that any stronger than that woman. So I bring characters into the work, okay? So let's begin, let's start at the beginning. You have an idea. Something happens. You see things. I always used to tell reporters that worked for me when I was an editor, let's go for a ride around your town. Let's ask some questions. How come all the how come the buildings in Summit, the school buildings in Summit look like castles? And that's how they look in Maplewood too. And you find out there's the same architect. And they were built in the 1910s and 1920s when America had this Anglophile thing going because some king visited. True. That's why the South Orange firehouse and the Summit school building looked the same, because it was sort of that time in development. So you have to have an intellectual curiosity that you can't teach people. All right, so I have that. And when I teach journalism, I teach kids that. Look around. What do you see? What interests you? Because chances are what interests you is going to interest most people. Because unless you're a sociopath, you're not much different than your readership. And if you think you are, you're in the wrong business. Because as a journalist, you speak to people by speaking for people. And you're one of those people, okay? My middle classdom is one of the strongest aspects of my ability to communicate with average readers, with average people.
All right, to that point, and great question, by the way. To that point, certain people, and you certainly have it, we talk about it, you mentioned the word feel. And when people read your columns, they learn, but they also seem to feel the character. They feel it. How does that come about? Because not every journalist and author can do that. Matter of fact, very few can. Jerry Eisenberg is somebody who does. You do. Mm-hmm. Where did that come from?
Well, I think that it's just a sense of you have to have there's four things you have to be a successful journalist, and this is what I teach. Number one, you have to have empathy. Number two, you have to have intellectual curiosity. Number three, you have to have a sense of story. And number four, you have to have integrity. And none of those things can be taught. And a sense of story is like the first cousin of intellectual curiosity. Why are those buildings like that? Why did this happen? Why they call it Beacon Hill? And you get to the bottom of things that way. Some of journalism is correcting what's wrong. Some of journalism is telling people things they might not know. The things that interest me probably interest to some extent most everybody in the room. The things that I find offensive or feel that are unfair, probably 90% of you feel the same way. We may differ on gun control, but we all agree that nobody should be shooting up a grammar school, right? So there's some common ground, and then now our job is to find it. So I think that's sort of how you communicate and to be sort of a regular person. And when you introduce characters and you can tell, one of my favorite stories from last year, and I hate to keep saying this, but I wrote this great story last year about this old English guy that he came here with his wife on a visa, and the wife got sick and died, and so he overstayed his visa, and the country threw him out. Now there's 18 million illegal immigrants, and some 92-year-old guy whose only living relative is his son, who's an American citizen, they won't allow into the country. So this bizarre, case of, enforcement of the letter of the law against the most, vulnerable victim. And that's a great story. Now, so like when the people contacted me and said, hey, we have this problem, I mean, at that point everybody was talking about immigration and everything, but it's like the human element of that, the government stupidity, the frustration these people had in trying to get this old man to be able to live out his life with his only son. Those are great stories, and if you can't recognize that as a story, you can't,
And the good ending is you wrote a column just recently that he isn't in here now and he's living. Yes.
Yeah, we got the ball rolling. Every now and then you do something good, and that column kind of got the ball rolling on getting him back.
Mark, a lot of people that I know, as we've gone through life, all of a sudden they have a desire to write a little bit. Maybe they want to, write about their family or their own experiences. And, you wrote a book, and I'm sure there's a number of people in here that have written some things, a journalist over here, and I know a writer in the back. But oftentimes they're hitting these blocks. What suggestion do you have for someone that wants to create a story?
Well, I've been paid several times in my life to actually give writing seminars, and people come in. They're all they have their pads out. They're going to take notes and say, okay, I'm going to tell you the secret now to writing. Okay, get ready, write it down. Ready? The secret to writing is writing. The secret to writing is writing. I have one of my boys is in the back here, and he can attest to the amount of times I'm sitting there, cursing, 4 o'clock in the morning, trying to get something done, yelling. Look, guys, I can't deal with the fact that the kitchen's on fire. I'm trying to get this column done, and it's true. Like you just have to, you got to like slog through it. And one of the interesting things to me, and I'd love to talk about this with anybody who wants to. When I started to write fiction, and I'm working on my third novel. My second novel is with a publisher. When I started to write fiction, I always heard this like writer baloney about, it's its own organic thing. It has a life of its own, and that's baloney. And then I started to do it, and I realized it's true. That my first novel, the linchpin idea of that book, the very reason I wrote that book, is no longer in the book. Because the book evolved as I wrote it, and then rewrote it into something different. And so if you want to sit down and write a story, if you want to sit down and try to be a writer, my first piece of advice is don't do it. Find another hobby. It's not as frustrating. My second piece of advice is if you're going to insist on torturing yourself, give yourself a chance to bring it to the table. And one of the things that has made me very successful when I'm being successful, because there's plenty of times when I'm not, is sort of a disciplined approach. Now I have a notebook, and when I'm in a writing cycle and I'm actually doing good, I write down when I start writing and when I finish. And I write briefly what the scene was, and then I'll write what I want to do tomorrow. And I'll find that I can sustain that for days and days and days and days and days. And then I take a day off, and that day becomes 2 days off, and then it's next Thursday, and then it's, no, gee, I haven't written in 3 weeks. So that discipline of bringing yourself to it every day is so important. And when I'm trying to finish a book, people would say to me, when do you find time to write? And I say, between the time I have to pick that kid up at soccer practice and start making dinner. You know, in those 15 minutes, that's when I find time to write. In that hour, between the time I wake up and I've had coffee and I've read the paper and I have to get ready to go to work, in that hour, that's when I find time to write. In that 20 minutes, when by some miracle, all the children are occupied, then I write. And that's really how you have to do it. You have to bring yourself to it every day, and then set yourself up in a situation where you can access it easily and get going again, even for the shortest amount of times. Because as long as you're actively writing, you're actively thinking about it. And thinking is part of the writing. You know, people, it's funny, like people, I draw this analogy, like, well, how do you write a song? Like, it doesn't just pop into your head. You know, you have a riff and you work that out and you work that out and you build something around that and you think, and the same thing is true of writing. Nobody sits down and says, oh, well, this is the book I'm going to write. They start and then they build and they take different paths and then off you go.
So the rest of us are human. Hearing this from you, it's good to know that we all have our stops and starts and blocks, and 10 minutes, then we end up
There's
breaking.
plenty of times in my life where I think to myself, like, if I was afraid of heights, I wouldn't be a bridge painter. I can't stand sitting still. Why did I choose to become a writer? Like, I'm not a sedentary person. Why did I choose this of all the things to do in life?
Well, that will be for another interview, I am sure, Mark DiIonno. I have to tell you, do we have time for a couple questions? Okay. Yes.
Yeah, Mark, you mentioned getting out of the office. Does the Star Ledger have an actual physical location anymore? I mean, it's no longer a Star Ledger Plaza or 217 Halsey Street or any
No.
place like that.
My office is my bedroom now, but I'm able to go to a place in the Gateway Center. We have an office there. I mostly work from home, which I don't like. I used to really enjoy being in the newsroom. The company's been split, so there's only 12 of us that actually still work for the Star Ledger, and that includes like the financial guys and everything. There's only 12 of us. There's only a few writers. All the columnists still work for the Star Ledger. The bulk of the newsroom was shifted to Woodbridge, and those people work for New Jersey Advanced Media. And that is the internet. That's the internet company. So the company is investing very heavily into their digital future, and the paper is still viable, but in that transformation, a lot of people left. Some were laid off, and some just chose to go other places. It's been tough. It's been sad. A lot of my friends have left the paper, and there was a point in time where I was the editor in charge of all the bureaus, and I hired about 45 reporters in that 10-year period, and every one of them is gone. You know, we used to have, here in Union County, we had 6 or 7 reporters in a bureau. Now they have 1 or 2. And they're not in the bureau, they're in the courthouse. So there's just been a shift in how they're covering the state, which I think is apparent to people who read the paper.
Mark, is there a copy desk anymore?
There is. Yeah, I'm going to answer the question. There is a copy desk anymore. They put out a lot of papers. They sort of have this a universal desk, and so they do a lot of work. They put out not just the Star Ledger, but the other Newhouse papers in the region. So, you know, your question is, why are there so many mistakes in the paper? And my answer to that is, you know, the amount of work that they've done and the amount of people to do that work has shrank.
Yes, sir.
In another medium this year, there was a very successful story about investigative reporting. Spotlight, which won the Academy Award.
Sure.
Did you misread with that at all? I mean, just.
Well, I knew the story when it happens. I didn't see the movie, but I knew the story when it happened. And
Which was a book earlier.
Sure. Sure. I mean, and it's exactly what you know, what journalism should do. It should challenge power and authority. And I think that to go back to the beginning of the conversation, when you have companies, when the media is sort of going towards the sensational and the clickbait kind of things, those stories die before they get a chance to really gain momentum. Because if it doesn't have everybody's attention every minute of the way, then it gets given up on. And certainly the places where people can spend months and months and months investigating a situation, the places where that can happen are becoming fewer and fewer and farther between.
Mark, I think the public would like to talk to you after the interview, so I'm just going to ask you 3 or 4 real quick questions, please. Kind of unconventional, but we're going to go forward. First of all, reporter, columnist you admired the most?
Jerry was my mentor. Jerry Eisenberg was my mentor. He really, I had him as a student in college. We developed a lifelong friendship. And he really taught me sort of, I'll never forget when he said to me, you have to find your own truth and tell it, because there really is no truth. There's your truth. So, yeah, okay, I'll do that. I can do that. And so, yeah, Jerry's the
most influential column that you wrote?
Oh, man.
As you think about that.
I think that the best work I ever did was the homicide series. I think that it really opened people's eyes up to the lives of those officers, those investigators, and just the, you know, the sort of wanton violence that had claimed these cities. And not in a Hollywood way. It wasn't The Wire. It wasn't any, this was real stuff. This was getting to understand what it meant when somebody said they had their brains blown out, because you could look into somebody's head and it looked like an empty jack-o'-lantern, you know. And the violence on the street, the grief of the families, which, you watch a Hollywood movie, 50 people get killed, but you don't go to any funerals. You don't see the children growing up with their father, the cop, the parking attendant that just gets blown away by whoever, Bruce Willis or something, you know. One of my favorite scenes in my novel, was the sensational reporter is at the fire of the Morro Castle, and he sees people coming off the boat who have been burned badly, and then they're swimming in salt water. So they're in absolute agony. And he's tremendously moved by this, because he's now seen real suffering, and he's seen something that at that point only war veterans would have experienced, or people that were like in house fires or industrial accidents or something. And the narrator of the book, it dawns on him, as the old guy is telling him that story, that dawns on him that callousness to suffering has become ingrained in the society, because then you can go to a movie and see a girl chopped up with a chainsaw. You know, we see suffering on television 50 times a night. That human suffering is actually comic to people, that they laugh at it. In our popular culture. And that in the 1930s or the 1920s and even the 1940s, the only people that had that kind of visual experience with it were people who actually saw it. It wasn't brought into your living room. It wasn't done for a theatric purpose. So that's why I thought that series kind of really grounded home to people.
You write often about veterans, and with all the things that you've seen and you've dealt with, both with bureaucracy and some of the disappointment that we see within our own nation, what keeps you so patriotic?
I'm not sure I am. One of my boys in County College said, "Dad, do you mind if I want to go to look at McGill University in Canada?" I said, "You know what, after this election cycle, make sure you find an apartment with a kitchenette." Marry a Canadian girl, make sure there's room in the basement for your father, listen, I still believe, I believe in the country. I believe in the people in the country. People always say, well, we could never fight another World War II, and I don't know if I believe that. I think that we have been splintered. I think that beginning with Bill Clinton, so 8 years of Clinton, 8 years of Bush, 8 years of Barack Obama, we've had a political process where the party not in power, his main agenda was to wreck the presidency of the party in power. And it goes both sides. I'm not going to start a right-wing, left-wing political conversation here. But the fact that the country came first and we're sort of all behind whoever the public says they want to lead has sort of become an outdated, an old-fashioned idea, unfortunately. And I think this election cycle might, I'm always optimistic that it might kind of wake people up to the fact that we've gone off the rails. Certainly the politicians, if they have an ear to the ground, this has really been kind of funny. I wrote a column a couple weeks ago, and I was one of the first people I know to say this, and people laughed at me. The Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street are first cousins. They're just people that are fed up and angry, and even though they're over here ideologically, they have the same DNA, And the same's true of Bernie Sanders followers and Donald Trump followers. They may be on polar opposites in terms of the ideology, but they come from the same place. They're fed up with the guys in office. And the guys in office have not been paying attention to this for the last 24 years that I can think of. That the public is tired of them not moving the country forward, not finding common sense solutions, common good solutions, common sense, common good solutions to the problems that we face.
And finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you this. The Lunchmobile, what's your favorite place that the Lunchmobile covers?
Oh, I started the Munchmobile, and then I did it for 1 year. It was my idea, actually, and then Pete took it over, and I haven't really followed it much since Pete took it over.
He's put a lot of weight on since.
Because I just, yeah, it's fun. Yes, sir.
Can I just ask a quick question?
Sure.
Going back to what you just said, I think this political situation, none of the above would probably get a lot of votes. How do you see this panning out? We can't develop a third party, seemingly. How do you see the next 10, 20 years?
I think the Sanders movement might be the seeds for a third party that's based totally on reform. And I've believed this for a long time. That if I were 30 years younger and 1,000 years better looking and richer, I would really consider trying to do something like to really create a reform party, a party that's based on just the reformation of how government is bought and paid for in this country. And I think Sanders really, if Bernie Sanders got away from the free education and the socialism and all that and stuck to reform of corporate interest in Congress, I think he would have won that nomination. I think the socialist stuff, I think the socialist stuff scared a lot of people. But I'll tell you something. My son Matt and I went down to Rutgers to watch him speak, and I was absolutely floored by the passion that guy. When we pulled into the parking lot, the lines outside, it looked like Rutgers was playing for the NCAA championship. And that guy really, a lot of people have responded to him in that way. You know, that there's something very, very broken here about how the government gets run. And he exposed that. And I'm not so sure he's not going to run. I'm not so sure. And wouldn't that be interesting? Because Bill Clinton was elected because Ross Perot, egomaniac, wouldn't get out of the way of George Bush, who was a great American, whether you like him or not. We are all Cold War people here, almost all of us. And to think that a standing U.S. president, when the Soviet Union fell, wouldn't get reelected would be preposterous, right? So wouldn't it be ironic if Hillary Clinton lost because of a third-party candidate that took her votes away? Interesting, huh?
Well, what is for sure, Mark DiIonno, on behalf of the Summit Library and Hometown Television,
Thank you.
We are so lucky to have you in the state of New Jersey. As I've always said, you are the heart and soul, and we thank you for the way you articulate the issues of the state.
Thanks, John. You're the best, as always.